Hey guys, and welcome to another one of my tutorials. So in this video, I'll be showing you how to set up an airstrike system. And like always, before we go ahead and get started, I want to show you guys exactly what it will look like when we're finished. So the way it works is if you press Q, it'll open up the airstrike window or the airstrike camera. And then currently my character is up here on top of this building and he's looking down this way. So if you click, you can see it does two things. It adds a little X over where you clicked, and it also takes away an icon down here. So these icons represent how many bombs or airstrikes you have left. So I can click two more times. So I'm just going to click two more times. And then when you click the last time, it closes, and then it drops the airstrikes wherever you clicked. And then I can do that again. So I can look at this hangar, or I can have it hit this hangar, and maybe I'll hit once down here in the street. And there you go. And you also notice if I make it really close to me, there's actually a bunch of camera shake that happens. The closer you get, the more camera shake you have. All right, so one more thing before we start actually coding it. I just want to point out that this map and the explosions themselves are from some content packs, but you don't need the content packs in order to follow the tutorial. But if you're curious about the ones I used, I'll just show you real quick. So for the map itself, it's this map, this industrial area hangar, and you can find this in the marketplace tab. And for the explosions, you can get the explosions builder if you want to use them. But again, you don't even need them to follow this tutorial. Okay, so with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and launch a new instance of Unreal. So I'm using 4.26.1. I always recommend being on the same version that I'm on or an even newer one. And then we're going to select games down here and hit next, and then first person and hit next. And then we want blueprints and we want to do starter content because we're actually just going to use the explosion from the starter content pack because I know some people aren't going to have the explosions that I have. So just so everybody can follow along, we're going to use the ones from the starter content pack. And so make sure you have with starter content up here, and then just call it whatever you want. I'm going to call it Airstrike tutorial, and then go ahead and create the project. And then while that's creating, I'm just going to move this guy over here so I can reference it. And there we go. Okay, so this is just the first person template with no changes, right? So we want to do a couple things here before we get started. So first of all, let's come back to the content folder here and right click and make a new folder and call it Airstrike. So inside of here, we're just going to put pretty much all the files we're going to be creating that are related to the airstrike. And then let's also set up an input binding real quick. So come up here to project settings, or sorry, edit, and then project settings. And then on input on the left here, we want to add a new action mapping. So hit this little plus button and then call it like airstrike, and then just set it to whatever key you want. So I'm just going to set it to Q. And there we go. All right, so let's go ahead and create the blueprints we're going to need first, and then we'll kind of fill them out as we go. So the first thing we want is that Airstrike camera, which is going to allow us to have a nice top-down view. So let's right click and go to blueprint class, and we want to select pawn here because we're actually going to be possessing this camera. So select that, and we'll just call it BP underscore Airstrike camera. And then the next thing we want is a widget. So right click, user interface, widget blueprint, and we'll call this the Airstrike underscore widget. And this is going to be the widget that kind of overlays on top of the camera view that shows you where you're clicking and how many bombs you have left, that type of stuff. And then we also want one for the marker itself, which are those little red X's. So we'll make a new widget blueprint again, call it Airstrike underscore marker. And then we also want, what do we want? Oh yeah, we want one for the explosion. So make a new blueprint class of type actor and call it BP underscore Airstrike explosion. Okay, and we'll come over and fill these out as we go. So we'll kind of be hopping between them. But now let's go to our character. So go to your character's blueprint. If you're using the first person template, you can just select this guy and click on it over here to open it up. And down here at the bottom, we want to add that airstrike event. So right click and search for airstrike. and add the Airstrike action event. And so what we want to do here is whenever they press the Q key or whatever key you use to bind to it, we want to switch over to that camera. So in order to do that, we're going to need a reference to this camera thing. So we need to actually add one of these to the world, one of these guys down here. But I guess first we should probably add a camera to it. So let's open this guy up real quick. And then, oops, that's my other screen, sorry. And so on the viewport tab, we can come over here to add component, and we want to add a camera component. And then we want to rotate the camera so that it's facing down. So I'm going to press space and then rotate it -90 degrees so it's looking straight down. And then we're also going to change the perspective mode to orthographic, and that'll give us that nice 2D map looking view. And then for the ortho width, this is basically how much of the map it can see. You're going to want to change this depending on how big your map is, but I'm going to set it to, I think, 10,000 is probably good. And again, if it's too, well, I'll show you what this does in a second. Let's just drag into the world first. So drag in the camera, and then all you want to do is you just want to move it so that it's above the highest thing in your scene. So you can see right now it's above everything in my scene. If you move it up more or down more, like it doesn't actually matter because it's orthographic. So you just want to make sure it's higher than the highest thing in your scene and you'll be good to go. And so what that 1,000 does is it basically changes the size of this. So if we come back here to our Airstrike camera and we set it to like 2,000 instead, or sorry, 20,000, you can see now it's kind of like more zoomed out or as if it was further away. So you just want to choose a number here that encapsulates your map without too much extra on the sides. So I'm just going to stick with 1,000 for right now, which is totally fine. And we also want to give it like a nice drone looking effect to it and not just like a super clear camera. So back in the Airstrike camera, if we select camera and then we come over here to post process, I think it's under lens and then image effect. Yeah, so check all of these guys and you'll see what this does once we turn it on. I'm going to set all these to 0.75s. And if you come back and you look at your camera now, you can see it has kind of like a gritty effect. If you don't like that or you want to play with the values, feel free. This is just how I had it at the beginning. So, and then the one other thing I did is under color grading, under global, I set the saturation. So enable the saturation and then set it to 0. And that will make it basically black and white. So you can see now we have a nice black and white image here. All right, so let's think. So let's set it up first of all that we can press Q to switch to the Airstrike camera, and then we can click and go back. So in order to do this, let's start back where we left off in our first person character where we had this input action Airstrike. So we need a reference to our camera. So up here in begin play, we want to grab a reference to that object, that camera object. So we're going to right click and say get actor of class. And the class we want to search for is of course our BP Airstrike camera. And then we can actually just take this value, right click on it, promote to variable, and that will create a little variable over here on the left. So let's click on this and then F2 to rename it, and we'll call it the Airstrike camera. And then we'll make this private since nobody else needs access to it, and then make sure you hook this up to whatever else you have going on in begin play. So all this is doing is at begin play, which is when the game starts basically, we just find this actor, the Airstrike camera actor, and we save a reference to it. So that way we can use it later. So now back down here in our input action Airstrike, which again is when we press Q, what we want to do is we want to take this Airstrike camera actor and we want to switch to it. So in order to do that, we need to write a function inside of this Airstrike camera that's going to allow us to switch to it. So let's just compile and save this and then go into our Airstrike camera. And then let's go to the event graph. We can actually just delete all of this stuff because we don't really need it. And the first thing we want to do up here is create a new event. So add custom event, and we'll call this use. Or maybe we can call this switch to, because we're basically switching to this camera. And we want this to take in the player controller of the person that's doing the switching. So add a new input parameter over here, and then make sure it's of type player controller and object reference, and then change this to a player controller. or change the name to player controller. Okay, so again, this is going to get called whenever we want to switch to this camera. So the first thing we want to do actually is we want to get the pawn that this controller is controlling and we want to save it. And the reason we want to do that is because when we go and we switch back to the player, we want to know who to switch back to. And if we don't have a reference to the player, then we're not going to know who to switch back to. So we can say get control, or what's it called? Get control pawn. There we go. We want to take this and promote it to a variable. And we'll set this like so. And then over here, we want to change this to the controlling pawn. And then I'm going to set this private because nobody else needs access. And then one thing I like to do is hit this little eye drop down and select this box down here at the bottom. And what that does is it shows the access specifiers for your variables and your functions. So it's just easier to see what's public and what's private at a glance. Okay, so now that we have this saved, we'll come back and we'll actually use this later. The next thing we want to do is we want to tell this player controller to possess ourselves because we are the camera and we want to possess the camera. So we're going to actually make a little reroute node here by double clicking and then drag off of this and say possess. And then for the pawn, which is the thing we want to possess, it's going to be ourself. So we drag off of this and say get ref to self. And there we go. So now we're going to be possessing the camera. And so now if we come back here to our first person camera, or our first person character rather, we can now drag off this and say switch to. And for the target, we want to pass in our player controller. So to get that, we can right click and say get controller. And if you notice, this actually returns a controller, not a player controller. So we need to cast to player controller. But we know this is going to succeed because we're the player character. So we can just right click and convert it to a pure cast and then hook it up like so. And there we go. So now when we press Q, oh wait, actually we can't do it yet because we need to drag, or did we already drag the camera in the world? Yeah, we did. So we got our camera in the world, we got our player. So now if we run this and we press Q, this code should run and we should switch to that camera. So I'm going to press Q and there we go. We switched to the top-down camera. Okay, so that's the first step. The next thing we want to do is start setting up the HUDs. So you'll actually notice there's this little red cursor in the middle, and when I press Q, it kind of stays there. So I'm just going to totally get rid of this thing because I don't really like the way it's done anyways, and we're just going to replace it with our own HUD, and that way we can easily show and hide the HUD as well as needed, because when we go up to the Airstrike camera, we don't want to show the player's HUD anymore because you might have things like health or ammo on there that you just don't want to show. So I'll be showing you guys kind of how to set up that type of system too. So yeah, so let's remove that crosshair first, that little red crosshair. You can do that if you go to the project settings and you go to maps and modes, and then on this drop down here, we want to, for the HUD class, we want to just change it to none. And now if you'll run it, you'll see the little red thing's gone. And so now we want to replace it with our own. So what I'm going to do here is just right click and make a new widget blueprint actually. And we'll call this player underscore HUD. And just so you still have a crosshair, we'll just add one back real quick. So I'm just going to add a quick little image here to this canvas panel. And then we'll put it in the middle of the screen. So we'll anchor it to the middle here. And now that it's anchored, we just want to zero out the position, X and Y. And we can set the size to be 2 by 2, something pretty small. And we can set the alignment to 0.5, 0.5, so it's centered. And there we go. So now we have a crosshair. And if you wanted to add other stuff to your HUD, you would add it to this HUD now instead. And we're going to set it up so that it shows and hides at the correct time. Okay, so now to get this thing to show, we basically want this thing to show up, the player's HUD to show up whenever the player is possessed, and we want to hide it whenever the player is unpossessed. So fortunately for us, we have these handy little events over here for possessed. So let's override this one. And let's also override unpossessed, like so. And so inside of here, what we want to do is we want to, first of all, we want to make sure that the thing that is possessing us is the player controller, because otherwise we just don't care. So we'll say player controller, or sorry, pass to player controller. And if that succeeds, then we want to go ahead and create that widget. So we're going to say, right click, create widget. And the widget we want to create is our player HUD. The owning player is obviously this guy right here. And then we want to take this and we want to save this. So right click, promote to variable. And we'll rename this to the HUD underscore widget. And then we can set this to private as well because nobody else needs access to it. And then actually one thing we want to do here is we don't always want to just create it like this. We really only want to create it if it has not yet been created. So in order to do that, we can simply drag this over a little bit, and then we can drag in our HUD widget here and say get, and then we can right click on this part and say convert to a validated get, and this will tell us if it's valid or not. And so we can hook this up like so. So we want the bottom part to go in here. If it's not valid, then we want to actually create it and set it. But if it is valid, then we don't really want to do that step, so we can kind of skip over it. And then the next thing we want to do, let's just drag this in again and say add to viewport, which is going to add it to the actual screen. And so let's drag this over, and then I'm going to just add a little reroute node here by double clicking and then hook this up like so. So you can see basically the logic here is we're checking if it already exists. If it does exist, we just re-add it to the viewport. If it does not exist, we create one and then we add it to the viewport. So this is just guaranteed that we only create it once. And then the next thing we want to do whenever the player is possessed is we want to make sure that the input mode is set to game only. So we're going to see here. Let's just make a little reroute node and drag this over and say set input mode game only. And we can hook that up to there. I'm just going to add a little reroute node again to make it a little bit cleaner. And then finally, the last thing we want to do here is we want to make sure that the mouse cursor is hidden. And the reason we're doing this step is because once we go to the top-down camera for the airstrikes, we're actually going to be doing the opposite. So we're going to be setting the game mode to UI only so that we can click around, and we're also going to be showing the mouse cursor. So this is just undoing that. So we also want to say show mouse cursor or set show mouse cursor. We want to make sure we leave this as false. All right, so that's what happens when the player gets possessed. And then when he's unpossessed, we kind of want to undo that or do the opposite of it. So, we want to make sure that the HUD is not shown at least. So again, let's just copy this node because we want to make sure that the thing that unpossessed us is the player controller. Otherwise, we don't care. And then all we want to do here is we want to check if this HUD widget is currently, I guess we can check if it's valid first. So we can right click, convert to validated get. And so we want to say if it's valid, and we want to know if is in viewport. And so we'll check this, do a branch. So if it's valid and it's in the viewport, then we want to remove it from the viewport. So HUD widget, remove from parent. And there we go. So again, I'll run this in a second, but just to summarize, all we're doing here is when the player pawn is possessed, we are creating the HUD widget if it's not already visible, and then we're showing it, and we're just making sure that it's set to game mode only and that there's no mouse cursor shown. And then when we're unpossessed, like for example, when we possess the Airstrike camera, we just make sure that the HUD widget gets removed from the screen. So you'll notice now if I play it, you can see that little dot in the middle of the screen. That's the player HUD widget that we created. And when we press Q, you can see that little dot goes away. So that's the first step. So that's how you show and hide your HUD correctly. And then the next thing we want to do is, if you notice from my other project, I'll just run it real quick. When I press Q, I actually have a new widget that I show here that says Airstrike at the top. It has these little things down here at the bottom, and it allows you to click around. So when the Airstrike camera is possessed, we want to create that widget and show that widget. So we kind of want to do something very similar. So back over here in the Airstrike camera widget, let's right click, or actually no, let's come over here and override the possessed and unpossessed events again. So possessed and unpossessed. And this is going to look very similar to what we just did, except we're going to be doing it with a different widget. So again, we want to make sure that this is the player. So cast to player controller. And then if it is the player controller, this time we want to create the Airstrike widget. So right click, say create widget. And this one we're just going to recreate every time because we actually want to do that because we want to reset it Like we want those red X's to go away each time you open it up. So it's easier just to create a new widget each time. So inside this dropdown, select Airstrike Widget. Oh, I named that one wrong. I just realized that. Let me browse back to this guy real quick. This one, and this Airstrike marker should be called, well, it should still be called Airstrike marker, but with no underscore, and then underscore at the end for widget. That's what I meant to call it. So Airstrike marker underscore widget. Let me just save all that. Okay, so right. So now we create the Airstrike widget, and then we can hook this up to the owning player. We want to take this and promote it to a variable, and then we're going to call this our Airstrike widget, and we will make it private because nobody else needs access to it. And then let's see here. The next thing we want to do is we want to add this to the viewport. So let's just drag off of this, say add to viewport. And then we also want to set the input mode. This time we want to set it to UI only, and we want to show the mouse cursor. So I'm just going to make a little reroute node here, drag this over, and say set input mode UI only, like so. Drag this down a little bit. The widget to focus is obviously going to be our Airstrike widget. This you can kind of set to whatever you want. I have it set to locking so that the mouse stays inside of the screen. And then we also want to say show mouse cursor, and we want to make sure we set it to true so that way you can see the mouse when the Airstrike window is open. Okay, so that's the possessed, and now we just need to do the unpossessed. So back over here, we want to, again, I'm just going to copy this. I want to make sure that it is the player controller. And if it is, then we want to remove the Airstrike widget from the screen. So again, we'll drag this guy in. We will right click, convert to validated get, say if it's valid. And we can also check, just to be safe, we can say is in viewport, which it should be, but it doesn't hurt to check. If it's in the viewport, then go ahead and remove it. So remove from parent. And then we want to also set this guy to nothing, basically. So if we drag him in, we say set, and then we just leave this empty here. We don't actually set it to anything. And I'll set it to nothing. And so that way, when it comes back in here, it's just going to override it again. Okay, so I think this is good. We still don't have a way to actually close the Airstrike widget yet. So I'm trying to think. Let's start working on this widget because we need a way to actually close it. So let's click this little magnifying glass here and open up the Airstrike widget. And we'll start kind of filling this guy out real quick. So the first thing I want to do here is we're actually going to be using, well, I don't know if we still need to do this. Let's just rename this to the main canvas panel, just so we can easily reference it, and then set it to variable, because I think we're going to be using this as a variable in our graph. So just do that first. And then at the top, we want to add some text. So drag in a text here, and then click on it, and we want to anchor it to the top middle. And then now that it's anchored, we can zero out the positions. You can zero out the size too, because we're actually going to use size to content. So we'll just select size to content here. And then for the alignment, we want to set it to 0.5, so that way it aligns nicely. And then for the position Y, we can set it to like 50, so it's not exactly on the top. And then we can call this, or call it like Airstrike, or whatever you want to put here for the text. And maybe you can make it red or something, and then probably make it a little bigger, something like that. I'm not going to go into too much crazy detail here, but you get the idea. You can kind of set up this window to show whatever you want to show during the Airstrike. And then the other thing I had is down here at the bottom left, I had these little, I'll just show you again. I had these little icons here that represent how many bombs you have left. And oh yeah, I forgot to say this at the beginning. So I actually got these icons from a content pack, but obviously feel free to use any type of image you want. I'm just going to grab them again. I'll show you which pack I'm using, but you guys don't need them. Like, again, you can just use any image you want or just leave it as a blank image for right now until you can find an image that you like. But just because I don't really have any images on my computer, I think the one I use is this Pro icon pack. Feel free to download if you want. I don't know if it's still free or not, but I'm just going to add this to my Airstrike tutorial just so I have something to work with here. But feel free to change these out to whatever ones you want. All right, so we're going to add a horizontal box to our canvas panel, and then we're going to anchor this to the bottom left. And then we're going to add an image here. And we actually want to add 3 of them, but let's just add one of them first and set it up correctly. So add the image you want, and then for the brush, select whichever image you want. If you don't have an image yet, you can just leave it blank and just leave it white. I mean, it'll work fine for the time being. But I think I have, what is it called? One from the content pack that I used is this T Dagger 2, 64 by 64. And then for, let's see here. For the horizontal box, we need to come back here and hit size the content. And then we also want to zero out the position X and Y so that it goes down to the bottom left here. And then we also want to set the alignment to 1. And then you can kind of move it out from the side a little bit, like maybe 50 on the X and negative 50 on the Y. And then there we go. So let's rename this guy to bomb image 1. And then let's just duplicate this guy twice. So duplicate and duplicate. We'll call this one bomb image 2 and bomb image 3. So there we go. We have our 3 bombs. And then I think that's all we need for this part of it. So we should at least be able to see this working now. So if we press play and I press Q, you can see it now shows this Airstrike widget to the screen. And if we had a way to go back to the player, you would see it disappears. So let's try to kind of set that up next. So in order to do that, the way I have it set up in the system that I made is that once you click 3 times and you use up all your bombs, it automatically closes it. So in order to do that, we need to override an event here. So come back to the graph tab, and then over here on the left under functions, we want to override the mouse button down. This one, mouse button down. So this is obviously going to get called whenever the mouse button's pressed. And so what we want to do here is eventually add some logic to keep track of how many bombs there are. But for right now, let's just say, let's just pretend like we used up all the bombs just so we can get it closing. So we actually made a function for this. So make a function and call it on bombs depleted. We can just make this private. And so we want to call this function. So back here in on mouse down, we'll call on bombs depleted just right away. And again, we'll add the code in later to actually keep track of how many bombs we used. And then we want to return handled because we handled it like so. And so now inside of on bombs depleted, we can write the code to close the window. So the way this is going to work is basically you click, 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 and then it's going to wait like a half a second, and then it's going to close the window, just so you can kind of see for a half a second where you clicked at the very end. So to do that, we're just going to say set timer by event. So, and then we're just going to create an event, and we're going to set the time to 0.5. You can put a different time here if you want. Again, this is just how much time you want it to wait until it closes after you click the last click. And then for the function, we're just going to say create a matching function, and that will create us a function. And let's just rename this to on close, and we'll set it to private as well. And so inside of here, we want to dispatch an event to let the Airstrike camera know that all the bombs were used. So we're going to create a event dispatcher. So make an event dispatcher and call it on complete. And then we actually want this to take in some parameters. So this is going to take in an array of all the different locations where the user called in the bombs at. So make a new parameter here, make it of type vector, and then hit this little button here and select array, and then call this Airstrike locations. So once they're finished clicking all the clicks, it's going to send this event dispatcher, or it's going to dispatch this event dispatcher, and the Airstrike camera is going to get notified of all the locations where you clicked, and then it's going to basically spawn the bombs for you. So all we want to do here is we just want to drag this in and say call, like so. And then we'll be hooking this up here in a second. But, oh, it has to have something. So let's just right click on this and say promote to variable, because we're going to need to do this anyways. And then we can compile and save. And you're going to get this note here about no value returned by reference. I Googled this, and it seems like it's just like a bug sort of with Unreal. It doesn't actually hurt anything. But if you see this note here, and it just says the same thing mine says, just ignore it, because it's not going to actually matter. Okay, so now that we have this on complete bound, we need to actually listen for it inside of our Airstrike camera. So if we come back to our Airstrike camera, and then we want to go to the top part here. So this event possessed. So we basically want to listen for that event. So that way we know when the player clicks 3 times, and we can be alerted of that and handle it accordingly. So in this case, we want to actually close the UI once they click 3 times. So let me move this bottom section down a little bit, just so we have a little bit of room, because we want to add something in here in the middle. So right after we create the widget and we set it, so right here, I'm going to take all this and then just use the arrow keys to kind of drag it over. And then I'm going to unhook this one and just hook it up here, so that way it's not having a line going across. So we just want to add one node in here. We want to bind to that event. So we can drag off the Airstrike widget and say bind to on complete. And then we want to kind of add this in here into the middle. And then we can drag off of this and say create event again. And then we can say create matching function. And so that creates us this function over here. So essentially this function is going to get called whenever the user finishes clicking 3 times and he's decided where he wants to drop bombs. And it's going to tell us right here all the locations where we should drop bombs at. So inside of here, eventually we want to actually drop bombs here. So we'll just kind of start writing that code and then just leave it to do. So we'll say for each loop, and we'll hook this up. And then I'm just going to hold down C and just hold down C to create a comment. And we'll say to do spawn bombs at location. And so that's what we're going to do here. So I'll just say little reroute node. We need to come back and do that. And then when that's finished, we want to possess the player, because we want to switch from the camera back to the player now. So that part we can actually do, and that's why we saved this controlling pawn. So if you drag in the controlling pawn, if you remember, this is just the pawn of who initially switched to us, so it's going to be the player. And we can drag off of this and say possess, or I guess no, we need the controller. So we need to right click and say get controller, and we want to say possess, and the thing we want to possess is this old pawn from before. And so that's going to switch us back to the player. We can do that off of the complete. And then for this return, we can just hook it up here, I guess. All right, so there we go. So now we should at least be able to switch back to the player once we do one click. So let's give this a run real quick. And then we press Q, and then we click somewhere, and then it waits, or maybe it doesn't wait. Maybe I missed something somewhere. Let me look, hold on. All right, I think I know what's wrong. So we need to go to our Airstrike widget, and then on the designer tab here, we need to make sure that these are set up correctly for their visibility. So the easiest way to do this is to select the top one and then shift click the last one, and I'll select all of them. And then over here, search for visibility, and I will say multiple values here because they're all different. But we want to actually set all of them to not hit testable, and that's going to make it so that we cannot click on any of them. And then we want to select just the top one here and set it to visible. So that's saying only allow us to click in this area. And so that should at least give us click events now. So if we do this again, so if we do this again and we press Q and then we left click, you can see after a half a second or whatever you set that time delay to, it closes it. And you also notice that our HUD is back. So that little dot in the center comes back. So it goes away, this widget shows up, we left click somewhere, half a second later, it closes, and we're back to the screen. Okay, so now really the only part we need to do is the clicking to show where to drop the bombs at, and then the explosions, and then the camera shake. So we'll continue with that in part 2.